to this webinar organized by Gorrissen Federspiel, a Danish law firm, and think tank EUROPA. My name is Lykke Friis. I head think tank EUROPA. I'm also co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Another co-chair is on the line, Mr. Carl Bildt. We have with us here a heavyweight panel, at least figuratively speaking, because with us we have three former Nordic Prime Ministers. I made last night some rough calculations. Together you have 10 years of experience as Prime Ministers, 8 years as Foreign Ministers, 3 years as Minister of Europe, and 3 years as Ministers. So who do we have? We have Carl Bildt from Sweden, Alexander Stubb from Finland, and here with me in the room we have Lars Løkke Rasmussen from Denmark. And what we'll discuss is obviously how this war, Putin's invasion, has affected our region, the Nordic region. And I guess we'll also touch upon the battle of speeches that we'll have today, with the speech by Emmanuel Macron starting at 1:30, and then the speech by Vladimir Putin, which has all. Many Danes, like myself, we learned our Swedish by watching Swedish television, Björn Borg and Emil fra Lønneberg. So in principle, we could do this in our native languages, but we have decided to do in English because the plan is also that other people will be able to follow this webinar. So basically, what I'll do is I'll start by going to you, Carl, and ask you to give us an overview of how Putin's invasion has affected the national debate in Sweden, NATO, and so forth. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Lykke, and a pleasure. It would have been even more pleasure to be in Copenhagen, but you can't be everywhere, at least not at the same time. Well, digitally you can, and pleased to be with you. Before going to that, Lykke, I'll sort of broaden the perspective slightly, because I mean, what is happening now is much bigger than just what's happening in our part of the world or even in Europe. Because what has happened is that Russia, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, has launched a blatant aggression against another member of the United Nations. And if we go back to the fundamentals of international law, the international order that we are trying to build in different ways, we can go back to after the Second World War. There were the war crimes tribunals, as you might remember, in Nuremberg and in Tokyo, and they were fairly sort of diligent enterprises in setting down what is international law, interpreting. And they said that the supreme international crime, the supreme crime as they call it, against international law is the war of aggression. That is beyond war crimes. That is beyond crimes against humanity. That was even beyond genocide at the time. And when they condemned the leaders of Germany and the leaders of Tokyo to death, which they did, it was for the crime of aggression. So what Russia has done, Mr. Putin has done, is the most severe crime against the international order and against the international law that we have. And it was unprovoked, it was sudden, it was massive, and it was done with the explicit aim of getting rid of Ukraine. I've drawn the parallel with what Hitler did in September of 1939 against Poland. He wanted to get rid of Poland. He was very explicit about that. Poland was an artificial creation. Should be get rid of, together with the Russians, by the way, at the time. The same with Mr. Putin in Ukraine. He doesn't want Ukraine to exist, and he uses military means in order to realize that particular bizarre version of his. That is, of course, an affront of the first order against international law. And that's why there was a very strong reaction in the United Nations. 141 nations voted against it in an extremely strong resolution at an extraordinary session of the UN General Assembly. So we shouldn't forget that particular aspect of it, because that is fundamental. Then, of course, he has also as his aim to change the entire European security order. If we simplify things, we can say that all of us in this seminar have been trying to build a European security order based on the principles of Helsinki, of the OSCE, of the different conference of security and cooperation in Europe, on the Paris Charter, on the principles that we as nations cooperate freely and respecting the sovereignty of each other. He wants to upset that. What he did want to have was not a Helsinki II, but a Yalta type thing. The great powers decide. and he tried to get some sort of agreement with Americans. That obviously failed, because the Americans are not on the Yalta line, they're on the Helsinki line. But that is what he tried. Now, reaction in Finland and Sweden. Alex will speak to Finland, but it's difficult to speak on the nations separately, because our histories are intertwined, our defense is intertwined, our political debate is to a large extent intertwined as well. But clearly, reactions twofold: increased defense spending, an immediate decision by a government that has been against this, to go up to 2% of defense spending, and that will be done within a couple of years, even above that, with some of the things that we are now going to invest even more in. And then, of course, the decision to, which is more or less imminent, to seek membership of NATO. 30 years ago, there was a tectonic change in Europe when the Soviet Union collapsed. And that led, at the time, Finland and Sweden to join the European Union. Norway, unfortunately, stayed outside. It was very much Sweden, or to a large extent Sweden, that was in the lead in the process at the time. Now we have the second tectonic change in the order of Europe, and now is NATO. It's Finland more in the lead this particular time. But at the end, I think we'll operate this together and hopefully join NATO together. That's going to be important from another point of view. I think it's going to simplify also the relationship between NATO and the European Union, because NATO will be the #1 military alliance for the territorial defense of the European nations. But EU will be the security alliance, because EU has a broad array of instruments on security issues. And we've seen this in this particular crisis. The necessity of using sort of the military potential of NATO and the security potential of EU together. So we will see the two of the twins working much more closely together. And that's why we hope that we will now have a new possibility for Northern Europe as well. We will have all of the northern area, or the Nordic countries, as we call them, inside NATO. That gives sort of immense potential for us to coordinate. And hopefully we'll also have, if I can interfere into Danish politics, hopefully we will also have Denmark fully engaged in building the security alliance that is the European Union. Because I think it's going to be the interaction between the military alliance NATO and the security alliance EU that will be instrumental in building the more safe, more secure, more stable Europe. That will be quite a task and quite a challenge when we have dealt with the immediate effect of this outrageous Russian aggression. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Carl. We'll get back to the overall sort of connection between NATO and EU, because as I'm sure you know, this is a major sort of part of our referendum campaign here in Denmark leading up to the 1st of June, where Denmark votes on the EU defense dimension. But we go now to Alexander Stubb, former Prime Minister and many other things of Finland. Now you are Director and Professor of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University in Florence. But I actually preferred sort of the definition you gave of yourself the other day via Twitter, where you wrote, "I am the Finnish version of Birgitte Nyborg," after you have watched sort of the new episodes of Born. So over to you, Alex. Fill us in on the Finnish situation, and I understand that the 12th of May is a date that we should all watch.
Sure, yeah, no, thanks a lot, Luke. I think in the minister cavalcade, you forgot to mention yourself, because I think if I recall correctly, you were a combination of climate and environment in the olden days, so that adds to the package. But I think, you know, when we have 3 former prime ministers around the table, many of you are probably thinking, why are we smiling? Well, there's a reason for that. We believe that the working title former prime minister is probably the best in the world, which basically means that you don't have to take the shit anymore, and you can speak very freely. And that's what I'm going to do. Well, actually, I used the term crap on BBC Radio when I told that joke, and they had to come back later in the program to apologize because it was a family program. So there we go. Be careful. Luke, I'll make 3 points today, one on Finland, one on Europe, and one on the world. And of course, I agree with almost everything that Carl said, but there'll be a little deviation when we come to the world bit and UN votes. But let me kick off with Finland first. I think the 24th of February changed a lot of things. That for us was pretty much the day when a decision on NATO membership took place. And throughout our history, you have to remember that Finland has been quite quick to change tack. So in 1809, when we allowed the Swedish Empire to be by itself and moved to a part of the Russian Empire, we maximized our autonomy. That meant, pushing for our own language, our own culture, our own identity, our own currency, etc., etc. Same thing in 1917 when we gave Russia its independence. We declared it in the middle of the Bolshevik revolution. Same thing in 1944. We reluctantly accepted peace, lost 10% of our territory to Stalin, but went on to live with a very uncomfortable reality during the Cold War. It was all based on realpolitik and existence. So in 1989, the date that you have on the screen for the conference, but especially in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, we were very quick to file an application for EU membership, only actually 6-7 months after the Soviet Union collapsed. And yes, Sweden was in the lead. Carl, by the way, can you put yourself on mute because your papers are scrambling? But there you go. So Sweden took the lead and we followed. So for us, the 24th of February, it's sort of just an extension of our full and final integration into Western institutions. And my argument here is the thing that people forget, European Union, but that would have probably entailed a referendum on NATO membership and on EU membership. And the outcome of that would have been that we would have voted against NATO, but for the EU. So I guess, better late than never. The final point I want to say on Finland, you have to understand that our foreign and security policy thinking is based on two sort of packages of realities. One is geography and history. We understand that we cannot change geography, but we can nudge history in the right direction. We did that 1809, 1917, 1944, 1991, and now in 2022. And the second one is a combination of ideology and realism. Idealism and realism. Idealism in the sense that we always want to bona fide cooperate with Russia and try to make them into a part of the international community, but failing that, we're always prepared for the worst. That's why we have 900,000 reserves, 280,000 that can be mobilized within days, 62 F-18s, soon 64 F-35s. Missiles, etc., etc. On the NATO membership, the way in which it will work, as you mentioned, look at 12th of April, announcement by the President, 14th of April, Social Democrats, 15th and 16th, probably a get-together by the government and the President to make the announcement, and then state visit in Sweden, 16th and 17th. And so that's the basic, historic trajectory on this. I hope that we can fast-track membership because there'll be a gray zone between the moment we apply and the moment that we become members, and we'll see a lot of hybrid cyber and information attacks, like calling Astrid Lindgren a Nazi, as an example. Second point, EU and EU unity. And I'll be brief on the two last points in order to allow space for conversation. The EU unity was great in the beginning. Never seen it as determined, as quick, as adamant as this time around. The ESM during the Euro crisis took almost 4 years. COVID took 4 months. This war, 4 days. We got a wave of sanctions that we've never seen in the history of European integration. We saw a reversal of arms exports. Solidarity has been great. Having said all of this, don't expect this to last. War fatigue will hit in. People will start focusing on inflation, the price of food, the price of energy, and the asylum crisis. And you'll see some of the member states starting to use the moment. I mean, we're seeing Hungary that on doing that on oil embargo at the moment. Final point on Europe. Having said all of this, I think Europe has moved from a regulator to an actor. It's a regulatory superpower, but it was an actor during the Euro crisis, asylum crisis, COVID, and Ukraine. And on top of that, if we are to believe in Mark Leonard, which of course Carl and Luke does, because they are the co-presidents of the European Council for Foreign Relations, if we're entering an age of unpeace where virtually everything can be weaponized, so trade, information, energy, etc., etc. I think the European Union actually has a lot of instruments that can be used in the future and has become much more of a geopolitical player. My final and third point, the world. Remember, this is not a conflict about Russia and the West. It is as much about the West and the rest. We are at the moment extremely Eurocentric, and that's very understandable. We are Nordic-centric. That's very understandable. But actually the vote in the UN, yes, 141 was good, but it was a soft 141 that had to be really scrambled together at the last moment. 35 states abstained. They are over half of the world's population, of course, with India and China. You look at the debate in Africa, very non-aligned, very much a message that, listen guys, this is your mess. This is a European war with ramifications on us. Look at what's bubbling in Latin America. Both Bolsonaro and Lula basically blaming Zelensky for the war. The Middle East is lukewarm on this situation. India is lukewarm because it is the biggest importer of Russian arms. So what I'm saying is that we are also looking probably at the world order, which is not the one that was created in 1945 or 1989, something a little bit anew. And I think this is what we need to start thinking about. So this is more about the West and the rest, rather than only Russia and the West. That's all from me, Lykke. Thanks.
Excellent. Sounded like REM's song, It's the End of the World as We Know It. We now move on to the Danish perspective, to Denmark. As I mentioned, there'll be a referendum in Denmark on the 1st of June. On that particular situation, to those of you who are not following Danish politics 24/7, I can say that Lars Løkke has formed a new party called the Danish Moderate Party, not to be confused with the moderates in Sweden or the moderates in Born. And you are also here active as a senior special advisor at Gorrissen Federspiel. So what is happening in Denmark? Please take the floor here.
Okay, I'll move to. Okay. Well, I'm not quite sure whether this is a Danish perspective or my personal perspective, but
you choose.
Perhaps I can combine it some way or another. First of all, I would like to say that I think this is an excellent opportunity to discuss not only Ukraine but the geopolitical perspective in what's going on now. And I echo what Carl Bildt said and what Alexander said, and I'm not quite sure that our population totally, fully understand the implication of what's going on right now. And I think that's perhaps the most important outcome of this event today, because we need to make sure that our people actually understand that there is a before and after the 24th of February. And it will come with a lot of implications, which is not only about European cooperation, but it's also about, domestic politics in general. We have to increase defense spendings. We are ready to do so in Denmark. But until now, we have not told the population what will be the implications of that. We will simply, increase our debt, and that's not a long-lasting solution. There's a before and after the 24th of February, and many people refer to the invasion in Ukraine as a wake-up call. But honestly speaking, it is not the total truth, because we were, to some extent, half awake before the 24th of February. We knew, at least among political leaders, that we was too dependent on Russian energy. That was why we, from a Danish perspective, delayed the approval process regarding Nord Stream 2. We worked hard to to engage the European Council in that discussion. We worked hard to engage particularly Germany in that discussion, a more strategic discussion about the implication towards Ukraine, for instance. We knew, and we have known that for a couple of years, that we miscalculated the European security landscape by cashing in the peace dividend from 1989. That's why we, alongside other NATO member states, reopened our defense budget and increased the defense budget with real money, not to reach our obligations, but at least to get closer to approach our commitment from the Wales summit. So we acted. We also enhanced our cooperation between Denmark, Sweden, Finland in a military scope. So we acted, but honestly, we did too little and we did it too late. And we totally miscalculated the cruelty and cynicism in Kremlin. And by we, I mean me, Danish politicians and European leaders in general. We were too naive and we failed to highlight the necessity of a stronger and more united European response to Russian aggression in terms of sanctions after the invasion of Crimea and the poison killings in UK, just to mention a few Russian aggressions. But then you could say, fortunately, and excuse me for using that term in this context, but fortunately, we were not the only one who miscalculated the situation. Putin did some serious miscalculating as well. He underestimated European unity. He underestimated Ukrainian fighting spirit, as Thomas mentioned earlier today, and he totally overestimated his own military capacity. And that's why we are in a situation where we at least have some hope for the future. My main message today should be that we should not make the same mistakes again by not highlighting what's going on towards our population. We have this referendum coming up in Denmark, the 1st of June. I totally agree with Carl Bildt when he emphasized that this is not about European Defence Cooperation or NATO membership. It's a combination. It is, as he said, a possibility to combine the security dimension from Europe with the military dimension in NATO. That's the perspective. But if you listen to the Danish debate, it is quite funny that on the one hand, there's a huge majority of the parliament who ask the Danes to get rid of the Danish opt-out. On the other hand, there's a tendency that we almost, interpret the impact of what's it all about. It's just a detail. It's just an act of symbolism, and at least it is my opinion that that's not the fact. I mean, this is about more European integration, and we have to be aware of that, and we have to be honest about that. And for that reason, I am very, very pleased and happy that the people in Sweden and Finland are moving so fast. It would be much easier to convince the Danes that we should fully integrate with Europe if the Swedish and the Finnish people decide to enter NATO. I think I will leave it with that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Carl, I was just wondering, we have in Denmark this debate about there's a risk that the fact that Denmark joins the EU defense dimension, that could somehow undermine NATO. Could you enlighten us on that particular sort of theory, or do you see that as a complete sort of wild goose chase that we've engaged in? Is there a danger?
No, I would say on the contrary. What is going to happen is that with a stronger security dimension of the EU, that will strengthen NATO. Because NATO, as I said, is a military alliance. It operates primarily on issues of territorial defense, the heavy stuff, the heavy military stuff, which is absolutely fundamental. But if you look at the conflicts of today, a lot of them are more, as Alex mentioned, hybrid or cyber or infrastructure or all of those sorts of things. And there, the arsenal of security is more with EU than with NATO. And EU will then be sort of supporting NATO in all of these efforts, in the same way as NATO is supporting EU in territorial things. Just to take one concrete example, which is before this particular crisis, which shows this sort of interrelationship between the two. Absolutely key for the defense and security of the east of Europe is the ability of NATO to reinforce quickly, to get the forces up to, say, eastern Poland or up to the Baltic states. Well, that's easier said than done, because it needs infrastructure, it needs bridges, it means electricity connections, it needs railway systems. That is now financed by the EU. So EU is now financing the different mobility improvements that are necessary for NATO to be able to reinforce the East. And that shows that the security dimension of the EU is becoming more important. Then, of course, the security dimension, I don't know how Denmark handles this at all, with exemption. Now we have the European Peace Facility, which has been debated for a long time, which was originally set up in order to support peacekeeping operations by the African Union, financially supported. That is now used by financing arms shipments to Ukraine, in support of what also the NATO countries are doing. So you will have the two of them working very closely, increasingly close together, supporting each other. And that, I think, will be further strengthened by the fact that now Sweden and Finland will be in NATO, and hopefully Denmark will be fully in the EU as well.
I can say that Denmark is part of the European Peace Facility, because that's not part of our opt-out, but that's a bit slightly confusing, sort of the way the Danish opt-out was constructed. But
bloody strange.
Yeah.
Bloody strange, because that is the most concrete thing that the EU is doing now in terms of defense, and Denmark is part of that, but can't be part of sending police forces, I think, to whatever. But I'm not going to go into the details of Danish politics, because that would be very complicated.
No. But Alex, if you look upon sort of the ability then of the EU and NATO to be able to cooperate closer, if you would have Finland and Sweden joining NATO and Denmark joining the European defense dimension, what would be the biggest asset of that from a Nordic perspective? What would we be able to do today that we wouldn't be able, well, basically, that we are not able to do today for the future? What's the difference there?
Well, I think overall it's a sort of a win-win proposition. So us joining NATO and you hopefully getting rid of the opt-out, I think it will overall increase security in the Baltic Sea region, increase security in Finland, Sweden, and Denmark, provide a value added for the actual alliance. I think the way this might be going is the Europeanization of NATO. So I think that probably the voice of the European Union will end up becoming stronger inside NATO as such. You know, and Lars Lykke and Carl know that I'm an avid transatlanticist. And of course, I'm very pleased that the transatlantic reliance has been rejuvenated. But I'll be very frank with you, we don't know whether Joe Biden or Donald Trump or footnote of history. And I think that the strategic mistake perhaps that the Europeans has done is twofold. One is that we relied on Russian energy. Two is that we have relied perhaps too heavily even on American security. So I think this moment provides us an opportunity, on one hand, to get rid of Russian energy, but to maintain the American security umbrella, but strengthen the European pillar inside NATO. This could be my wishful thinking, I don't know. But the fact that we would have a founding state of NATO in the form of Denmark as a full member of European defense, I think is very much a win-win proposition. Let me finish off just by saying a lot of people keep on asking about what the NATO profile of Sweden and Finland is going to be. And my answer is very simple. It's going to be the same one that Denmark, Iceland, and Norway has had. And I think Carl has used the term, actually. It's a combination of reassurance and deterrence. So we will be, if I may, more of a Nordic profile than perhaps, I don't know, a Baltic profile. And Denmark then getting rid of the opt-out is all part and parcel of this package.
Good. Let's just have the final round on what will happen later today. Emmanuel Macron's speech to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Obviously, we don't know what he will say, but there could be sort of various countries working for treaty change, maybe also a new European convention. Is that something you would say, Carl, let's start with you, and then I'll end up with Lars here, and then I'll have Alex in the middle. Is that something that we need in Europe? Do we need a new sort of intergovernmental conference on institutions, for instance, on foreign policy?
I don't really see it, but let's see what President Macron has to say. It's always popular with the Strasbourg crowd. It's always it's a distinct crowd pleaser to talk about treaty change. But as I think President Macron knows, it is not necessarily a crowd pleaser when it comes to having that treaty change ratified in a French referendum. So I think there will be some care with that. There's quite a lot that can be done inside the present treaties in order to strengthen what we do. But let's see what he has to say. I would be skeptical against any sort of major institutional upsets.
But Alex, can you really accept a number of new member states without changing the treaty, or do we need to have more enhanced cooperation or maybe flexible integration? I remember reading a book about that at a certain stage.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I fully admit I'm an institutional nerd, and when Lars Løkke was Prime Minister, I was a humble civil servant negotiating, the Amsterdam Treaty, negotiating Nice, doing the convention, and then finally the Lisbon Treaty. And I think, after about 30 years of either preparing, negotiating, or ratifying a treaty, starting from the Single European Act, there's been sort of this treaty change fatigue. And to be honest, I don't think we would have ever gotten the types of changes that we got through the financial crisis or COVID or this war without, in an intergovernmental conference. Now, the backdrop of this is twofold. One is the conference on the future of Europe, which has ended, and I assume that Macron is going to tag on to that narrative. The other one is actually that I think, things are just moving so fast that a treaty change might even slow things down. And just like Carl said, if and when treaty change will require referenda, the cold fact is that, they are not going to be passed all around Europe. So I would kind of continue this incremental change that we are doing at the moment. And then perhaps one day, we go for a big one. But I do think that we will have a divided Europe. On one side, you have an authoritarian, totalitarian, aggressive, imperialist, and revisionist Russia. And on the other side, you have 40 European states, which are more or less democracies. And they will have different types of memberships in NATO, in the EU, in EFTA, European Economic Area, etc., etc. And this is going to be the sort of geopolitical reality that we have to deal with here. I would much rather focus on enlargement than institutional tinkering, but we'll see what Macron says.
Lars, any appetite on a new EU treaty?
No, I fully agree with what Alexander just said, because it's a reality of life that you need the support from the people to pass treaty changes, and that's not going to happen. But having said that, I welcome people as Macron and Alexander Stubb just a minute ago, giving this perspective of what's going to happen in a long-term perspective. Because I'm fully, I'm of course supportive of the transatlantic alliance, but I have personally witnessed Donald Trump in a NATO summit a few years ago, question marks to Article 5 in the treaty. And of course it's gone, but there could be a new guy in the White House. And Europe simply have to recognize that. And we have to take upon ourselves much more responsibility for our own security. And that's why we shouldn't underestimate the importance of what's going to take place the 1st of June in Denmark. And I think there's a tendency that some people, try to play it down. It's just a minor thing. It's not a minor thing. If Sweden and Finland join NATO, and I'm very optimistic about that after having listened to Carl and Alexander, and Denmark decides to get rid of the opt-out, there will be a stronger Nordic dimension in Europe and in NATO, and that is important.
Tak skal I have. Det var en fornøjelse. Det kan jeg godt sige på vores fælles nordiske sprog. Alex, Carl, vi ses i Berlin til ECFR-møde. Lars, også tak.